This is Geoff Garrett. It's the 31st day of March 2020, and I'm here with my friend and colleague, Larry Jameson. Larry is both the Dean of the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's the Executive Vice President for the health system, a system that Larry told me has 45,000 healthcare professionals in it. Larry, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here with you, Jeffrey.
So my first question to you is really a big how's it going from your unique perspective inside the healthcare system. Obviously, Pennsylvania, the tri-state area are really a center in the crisis in the United States, and you're one of the largest healthcare providers there is. I'd love your insider perspective on how big the demand on the system is and how your system is rising to the challenge to meet that demand.
Well, Jeff, one of the most important things I would say is we've been fortunate to be able to watch what's been happening around the globe, and it's been playing out over many weeks and months. So we've known what was coming, and we know how it comes. And unlike some crises like an earthquake that hits you out of the blue or a tsunami, we saw this begin in Wuhan province. That was back in early January. I think we all thought it might be limited to that area. But next was South Korea. Then it moved over to northern Italy, Iran, now across Europe. And so we've been able to see not only the globalization of the pandemic, but the rate at which it spreads. We've gotten a lot of information about the symptoms people have, how they present, what their clinical course is like, tips about patient management. So we've really been in the preparation mode, getting ready for this. And it's on our shores now. We're taking care of patients, but we've had a head start to be able to plan for it. And that was a major help to us.
So planning is great, but I mean, the scale of this, I think, is not only unprecedented, but awesome, right? So if you think about challenges, people are talking a lot about tests, equipment, and healthcare professionals. Could you give us kind of an inventory on where you think you stand on those three issues and maybe where the country stands?
Right. So one thing I'll mention, I think many of us have difficulty thinking in exponential terms. It's a hard concept until you graph it out and you literally walk from one day to the next and see how it plays out. And that informs every element that you just asked about. How many tests do you need? When do you need them? What kind of turnaround would be ideal? When you look at the personal protective equipment, how many care providers will need to wear this? How often will they exchange it? How long will this go on for? So immediately you're thinking about the supply chain. We've heard a lot about this on the news. And one of the challenges is every other place on the globe is facing the same issue with the supply chain. And so there are a lot of resourceful people thinking about ways to source masks and gloves and some of the face shields from other industries, for example, how to do 3D printing of either face shields or masks. So there's a lot of resourceful thinking about how to scale up to accommodate that. So the planning is, on the one hand, conceptual. What are we up against? And then it's very practical. How do we implement some of the organizational changes to make sure that we're not only thinking about it, but ready to go?
My heart and thanks go out to your workers who are being asked to do an extraordinary thing, which is to take care of people, not only for those individuals' sake, but for society as a whole. And they know that the people who work in your system know that they're putting themselves at increased risk. How's it going at the personal level for your dedicated staff?
No, you're absolutely right. I think when people decide to apply to medical school or nursing school, usually in their personal statement, they talk about their commitment to help other people. And when you begin to face this in real life, You have to train, to learn how to do it as safely as possible. And fortunately, this is not the first time we've encountered this kind of problem. We've seen an epidemic with HIV/AIDS. We've seen other flus like H1N1, SARS not that long ago, Ebola. So we've been rehearsing for how you maintain infection control and isolation and put on the protective equipment and take it off. But are people anxious? Yes, they're definitely anxious. And they're anxious not only for their own personal safety, but they're really worried that if they go home, am I potentially going to spread this to my children, a spouse, a relative, a friend? So we've actually taken a hotel next door to our hospital, and we've got 300 hotel rooms that we're allowing faculty to stay in. We're paying for that, either because they're working another shift and they don't want to use public transportation and try to come back, or they're afraid that they've got a vulnerable person back at home. But our frontline staff have been really resilient. These are heroes. I think a lot about them the same way I do our military, where we're constantly thankful and supportive of people that stand on the front lines to protect us. And now that's the healthcare workers.
So hero can certainly become a bit of a cliche, but in this case, there's no doubt that the frontline healthcare workers are indeed heroes. If we talk about physical capacity for a second, you've been leading the construction of a massive new hospital, a $1.5 billion project. It was going to take 3 or 4 years to build. It's not built yet, but you've now focused energy on getting the emergency department up and running to help with the crisis. Could you talk a little bit about how that's going and how you did it? It's a remarkable story.
Well, there's some other heroes to recognize here. So the first thing we did, just to back up a step, we canceled elective surgery. And the reason was, first, we get those operating rooms as intensive care units because they have ventilators in them. And second, we don't admit those patients post-operatively into a hospital bed. So we immediately created a lot of capacity by canceling elective surgery. And we canceled a lot of other elective admissions that can be put off. But we're looking sequentially at every possible location where we can have space, either to quarantine patients with COVID-19 or to take care of patients who don't have COVID-19. You referenced this new hospital. It's the hospital of the future. We were designing 500 rooms so that all of them could convert back and forth between a regular hospital room and an intensive care unit room. And so we've got our crew now working 24/7 to open about 120 of the 500 by April the 1st. And we'll do that in phases, a subset of those each week. And it's connected to our main hospital. So that immediately gives us 120 additional intensive care unit rooms. Now, again, it's an easy thing for me to say. We're planning this. Those construction workers have to not only finish the construction, but we have to get all the supplies in, and we can't have a hiccup because one missing part and the room really can't function as an ICU.
So I'm not sure how long ago you made that decision, but you referenced April 1, and I don't know whether I want to remind you that April 1 is tomorrow. We're getting there really quickly. So if we could sort of now move a little bit from your perspective at Penn to your view of what's going on more broadly in the crisis. Let me ask you a somewhat technical question, but one that I think has enormous import for how society understands the crisis, which is the scale and scope of testing. There's a criticism that says if we only test people who are sick, we're not going to find all the asymptomatic cases. We won't know the real incidence of the disease. And so people are arguing for random testing. But of course, the argument against doing random testing is, of course, you should focus the tests on the people who need it. So in a world where we don't have infinite testing, how do you think we should allocate tests? Is it just a question of scaling up the total number of tests, or do we have to think about an allocation mechanism?
Well, let me just describe a little bit about what this test entails. It's a pretty complicated test where you're trying to take the genetic material of the virus and then amplify that genetic material to a level at which you can detect it and say present or absent. So it's a technically sophisticated test. It's the kind of test we use for a lot of other viruses. The actual reaction itself, if you've got all of the reagents, can be done with high throughput. The problem is we've had limiting features both of the swabs that you use to get the material for the test and some of the reagents, because again, everyone is scaling this very quickly. But I would prioritize it mainly for people that have enough symptoms that there's a high probability that the test will be positive, so that the purpose of doing the test helps you with your decision making. This person needs to be isolated. They need to go into quarantine. We need to find out who their contacts are. If they've had high exposure, we need to test them, because the goal is to prevent the spread as well as to inform the treatment. Now, in an ideal world, if I had more tests, I would also want to be able to test that individual who was positive and declare they're now negative. They're no longer spreading the test. They can go back out into society. And third, you would like to be able to survey the population at large. I mean, to do that in a place like the United States with several 100 million people, you can see the scale of the testing that would be required. There's a second kind of test that people will hear about. It's a test for antibodies against the virus that demonstrate that you've been exposed and you've mounted an immune response. That's typically called an Anna-Lysa test, a completely different kind of test. That one is more amenable to population surveillance because you can do it more quickly, it's less complicated, it's a less expensive test. We could probably do a significant fraction of the American population within the next several months with that kind of a license.
And Larry, is it your understanding that that's what South Korea did? There's a lot of discussion about how quickly South Korea was able to flatten the curve, and it wasn't through radical quarantining. The conjecture is it was done through testing. Did they go population-wide?
They didn't. So if you think about how these exponential curves work, the way you stop this is you intervene at the very beginning of the curve. Because once it starts to take off, where every person is now infecting, several other, at that point you get into what we call the mitigation phase. If you can do what South Korea did, which they had a cluster in a church, who were all of their contacts, quarantine them, find the contacts, stop it, really early. It's almost like a forest fire that you caught, very early in the process instead of once it's beginning to spread into multiple points with the wind blowing. So I think the approach was very similar to the one we've taken here that just got started more quickly.
And do you think there are going to be any privacy issues in the US with this tracing of who my contacts were, who I was in contact with in the past couple of weeks, or will we be able to do that in a way that mirrors the South Korean strategy?
Well, there are potentially privacy issues. An old-fashioned way of contact tracing is I call you and we walk back through everything you've done for the last 5 days. Who have you seen? What was your interaction with them? Then we follow up with that person. That's very labor intensive. So the shortcut, in quotes, approaches of trying to track GPS information from your phone or other methods potentially has privacy issues. I think there are probably ways to get around those. It's one of these balancing acts of how do you protect the population as a whole versus the privacy of any one individual. That's forward-looking. I think it is something we should think about in the future because I believe that we're going to have more of these pandemics just because of globalization, more frequent travel, population growth, urbanization. So we really need to be thinking about what have we learned from the COVID-19 epidemic that will inform how we prepare for the next one.
So in the spirit of that, let's now talk about crisis communications and leadership a little bit. I'd love your thinking on the balance between being open and transparent and scaring people. So the issue obviously in the US right now is this very large band of projected deaths from the virus. How do you think about that balance between transparency and causing potentially unnecessary anxiety in the population?
I think it's really important for us to study the information as carefully as we can, have ideally several different groups doing this in parallel so the models that people create can be compared and contrasted. And then you need, and again, we had the fortune in this case of being able to say, how did it play out in northern Italy? How did it play out in Spain? And you'll remember at the very beginning of this how closely these curves tracked on one another at almost every place around the globe. So in this particular instance, the models were fairly predictable and reproducible. And so once you had a certain number of cases and you could predict the rate of doubling, the projections for when it would peak and what that peak would likely be were, I think, more solid kinds of predictions than we have for, say, a hurricane. It was very accurate and predictable. And I think the reason I would lean towards trying to communicate this is the major solution was to create physical separation. I mean, once someone gets critically ill with the pulmonary infection, it's mostly supportive care. So the best way to deal with this is to prevent it. And the best way to prevent it is to have pretty significant physical separation. We've studied 6 feet as the distance that these droplets can travel, and that's the way they're spread. So some combination of physical separation and cleaning surfaces has been the best approach. And the only way you can do this on a population scale is to have everyone participate in it, because we're all tied together in the case of this communicable disease.
So back to the communications question, the person who wanted to make that argument at a national leadership level was Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany. And I can't remember, it's now 10 days ago or so when she said 2/3 of the German population is going to contract COVID-19. She said that because she wanted Germans proactively to practice radical physical distancing. But that headline number is bound to scare people. But you would side with Merkel in a case like that saying if we don't act radically, here is the kind of things that could happen. You think that's the right messaging strategy today?
I just read yesterday in a summary put out by Goldman Sachs, a review of new cases both in Germany and in northern Italy. And of all the countries where this has broken out, at least recently, the decline in Germany has been among the sharpest. And you can track back to when she made that announcement. And it peaked, just after that. And they've had a very rapid decline. It's beginning to go down, it looks like, in northern Italy, but the decline is slower. And they've also had a pretty significant, clampdown on movement in that part of Italy. So I think that communication was effective. Was the number 2/3 right? We don't know. I mean, how do you ultimately get what's called herd immunity, where enough people in the population have developed immune reactions to this that it will stop spreading? It might be that high. So I think she may have not only been correct in her strategy, but incorrect in how the population responds to a virus like this.
So let me end by saying, Larry, that in the world of business schools, we talk about leadership a lot, and sometimes people feel a little bit jaded about that topic. There's a lot of messaging about leadership. We talk about it a lot, but we don't see it in action so much. It's just incredible to watch your leadership in action. And I want to thank you not only for joining us today, but for everything you're doing, not only for the University of Pennsylvania community, but for everybody in the catchment area for the University of Pennsylvania health system. We're eternally in your debt. And again, thank you very much for all you're doing.
Well, I appreciate your kind words, and we love being a partner with the Wharton School. We learn a lot about leadership from the Wharton faculty, and the Wharton students have more energy than any group I've ever encountered. Have a great day.